My name is Kayley, and I will be introducing the event before handing it over to Triskal to moderate. But first of all, it's important for us at the Games Institute to recognize the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge, laws, and philosophies of the Indigenous peoples with whom we share the land that we live and work on today. We're working to continually make space for Indigenous scholars, designers, commentators, and creators to uplift all voices that are marginalized in both the academic and the gaming communities. We acknowledge that the land that we work and live on today is the traditional land of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo, where we work, is situated on the Haldeman Tract, which includes 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River. I'm currently at home in Stratford, which is also positioned on land that was shared by these peoples as well. Our ability to be living and working here now in Waterloo region and in Ontario is the direct benefit of policies of expulsion and of assimilation of Indigenous peoples during the time of settlement and confederation. And since then, we have a responsibility as such beneficiaries to acknowledge and understand both the history and current experiences of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and for this understanding to then inform the work that we do so that we can stop perpetuating the damages of colonization and to begin to repair them. Land acknowledgements are just one very small step towards this. And if you want to learn more about what the GI is doing in relation to their commitment to anti-racism, decolonization, equity, diversity, and inclusion, please check out these pages on the GI website, which we will link to in the chat shortly. This event is part of the ADE for Games Communities in Culturing Anti-Racism, Decolonization, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Games Research and Creation series, which comes from the ADE committee at the Games Institute at the University of Waterloo, and it's supported in part by funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Games Institute, or as we often refer to it, the GI, is a research institute at the University of Waterloo that's home to interdisciplinary researchers who seek to advance the study, design, and purpose of interactive and immersive technologies and experiences. Our research, of course, includes games, but it also includes interactive and immersive media at large. We endeavor to be a place where researchers from all backgrounds can come to work together and learn from each other beyond the boundaries of any one discipline. So today we have with us some wonderful panelists. We have Dr. Katta Spiel, who is an FWF Hertha Framework Scholar at the HCI group of TU Wien, which is the Vienna University of Technology, where they work on the intersection of computer science, design, and cultural studies. Katta researches marginalized perspectives on technologies to inform interaction design and engineering in critical ways so that they might account for the diverse realities that they operate in. Drawing on methods from critical participatory design and action research on a background heavily shaped by queer theories and disability studies, they collaborate with neurodivergent and/or non-binary peers in conducting explorations of novel potentials for design, methodological contributions to human-computer interaction, or HCI, and innovative technological artifacts. We also have with us Triskal deHaven, who is currently on hiatus from pursuing a PhD in systems design engineering at the University of Waterloo. He holds a Master of Science in Human-Centered Interactive Technologies from the University of York in the UK, and a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Middle Tennessee State University in Tennessee, USA. He is formerly a user experience researcher for the Able Gamers charity and is currently working on or with Oculus VR for Meta. His main interests include making games more accessible for players with disabilities, virtual reality, and games user research. He's also interested in bridging the gap between academia and the industry through networking efforts. As for myself, I'm Cayley McArthur. I'm a Games Institute faculty member, and I do human-computer interaction research with a focus on inclusive technologies and inclusion in technology, which has quite broad applications and implications. Working in inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility in HCI requires us to interrogate perspectives, assumptions, methods, and artifacts encountered in our approaches to researching, to doing design, and developing new and existing technologies. So to that end, I try to publish that and engage in a diverse range of venues and a diverse range of formats in order to reach a diverse group of people as well. So with all of that being said, thank you once again for joining us today, and I will hand things over to Triskal to moderate the panel.
All right, thank you very much for Kayley. That was quite a lot to go through, so thank you much for handling that. I have a little bit of disclaimer on my side. So as you've probably been aware through our bios, a lot of us, the three of us are more familiar with virtual reality and virtual reality devices and the accessibility in the space. So a lot of our information is going to be centered either around that, but also in a more wider space and broader audience for it, accessibility as a whole. I do currently work as a contractor. However, from this point forward, I need to make it officially known that I am not in this role, or this panelist or operating this position is not affiliated with Meta in any way, shape, or form. So I won't be able to answer any questions specific to Meta or Oculus or the Quest, unfortunately. And finally, I'm also directing the co-director for the Games UR Summit that's coming in May 2023. I believe the dates are the 25th and the 26th, and it's being hosted in Seattle. So if you're interested in game user research, you can look into that. That's a little bit of a self-promotion there. It's also a hybrid event and will be fully accessible. So I'm gonna get started with a pretty simple question. So the first question that I've got for all of us is, what made you decide to tackle this subject? So Katta, do you mind taking over and asking that or answering that question?
By this subject, you just mean accessibility or accessing games?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, there is a personal aspect to it in terms of that, I'm so frustrated by games that don't let me play them due to some kind of assumption of what skillful gaming means or what a game experience should be or what a joy should be like. So that's a very personal thing. But also that affects peers. And then I looked at what games research is doing in that space, and it turns out they're just using a rhetoric of games to kind of make me do things that I don't want to do, and then, kind of delete all that kind of things that make games fun, and reduce all that, and then make me do things that I don't want to do, as I said. And I feel that's kind of, not cool. I just I think games should be fun as well, and and not just for me, but for all kinds of disabled peers, because solidarity is important to me. And so this is how I landed there. How about you?
So I'm in a similar boat. So I've been working for people with identify as marginalized groups for well over 10 years. I was involved in a lot of things in legislation and whatnot, originally in Nashville, Tennessee, where I was working on my bachelor's. So for me, it was just a really simplistic, or not simplistic, it was just a really normal decision to move into accessibility, where that's where a lot of marginalized people are affected in a grand scheme of things. Accessibility in games is especially important to me because, strangely enough, I don't have accessibility needs for most games. I don't have a lot of lived experience for accessibility, which is outside the norm for accessibility in games. Instead, I actually got into it when I tried to introduce people to the Souls-like genre and saw them have struggles with it, and which everyone is pretty much aware of, that the Souls-like are very difficult games. And right after I introduced some of my friends to it and saw their struggles, I started looking into where struggles lie and what kind of struggles people of all ages and demographics and other minorities come into play. How about you, Kayley? How did you get started in games and accessibility?
I think, like you, I'm somewhat of an outsider in that I don't play games very much myself. However, I think they are incredible vehicles for research, and I'm so fascinated by people playing games, and I want people to have the experience of playing games and enjoying that experience. And sometimes I get kind of preoccupied or caught up with ideas about fairness. And when I see something that looks unjust and unfair, like people not being able to enjoy something the way they should be just because of some design decision that was made that renders it inaccessible, then that's disturbing. And yes, I get very frustrated with that. And so I guess that's how it originally ended up. And I worked in industry for some time as a user experience researcher. And we started working on one day, like, oh, hey, if we want to sell to the government, our products need to meet certain accessibility standards, and seeing how complicated that ended up being was also just, it has stuck with me for many years because it shouldn't be so complicated as it is currently.
Agreed. That's actually a topic we'll probably talk about later. I've got a question devoted to that. So that was kind of an overview of how we got into this. I do want to give, it's about the 15-minute mark, so I'm going to give a little bit of an outline of the rest of the day's session. So I've got a list of questions here that we're going to go through. And then about the halfway mark, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So if you have questions as we're talking and we're going along, feel free to post them in the chat, or just keep them in your mind for when we open it up to those sort of questions. Between now and then, we're going to have some what I consider less spicy questions, just questions that we can all easily answer. That's not going to be very controversial in any way, shape, or form. So, Cayley, what are some ways people that are interested in the games and accessibility are making a difference in our world?
Oh my goodness, there are so many ways. Like, I have so many papers downloaded right now that I need to read because the amount of work in this area, I think, has just ballooned in recent years. But there is, of course, always that disconnect between academia and industry, where it could take a really long time for those ideas to actually end up in more like broader available games, or maybe they don't end up there at all because there are also barriers for people in industry to reach academic publications. They're paywalled, et cetera, et cetera. But I really appreciate when people are able to spend the time and to work with a certain group of people, just the amount that we learn and can take away from that as well to apply in our own work. But I wish we did a better job at disseminating that knowledge so that it's usable for more people.
Yeah, that's agreed. And then, Katta, this is more of a discussion. So if we ever say something that like you want to talk about more.
I was about to, first of all, I forgot to add that I was also, I have been involved in game design stuff. So, that just like then naturally kind of like, disabled people also played. And so I was always interested in making that aware. But like, to the point of like like it almost shifted to kind of like how do things come together and kind of like also having an impact in industry. First of all, I do see a huge push in industry as well towards game accessibility, and like the Discord got overwhelmingly large. That I have it on mute now, but like sometimes I look into it. So there is like a push in academia and in industry, but also there are people like I have a master's student, Matthias Wiegele, who is currently looking at the studio where he's working at, looking at like why aren't accessibility practices not kind of like ingrained in their practices, and what are the systematic and individual kind of like reasons for that, and what are the things that keep people from making accessible games. And I think that is really important kind of like work that is situated within both of these kind of like aspects, because it's directly working within the industry, but it's also trying to figure out kind of like transferable knowledge, and I think that is really, really crucial work as well.
Agreed. And for more context, the conference and the Discord that Katta mentioned. That's the Games Accessibility Conference and Discord. They are the dedicated IGDA special interest group for games and accessibility. They have a dedicated conference, and that's coming up April 24th and 25th. So that's actually happening soon. Definitely recommend going. It's a really great organization and group of people, to be honest. So Katta, what about some other things, ways people from our industry are making a difference in the world?
I find it interesting that you call those the easy questions, because it's like, you know, those are like big questions, kind of. I mean, it's also like you don't necessarily have to make a difference in the world either. I feel like that's a bit of a big ask. It's fine, like if you just make a little difference, like with a single person maybe, and then they can do the thing, right? Like, I mean, I've done a study that due to COVID then was like with one single individual, so that never got published. But we did a study with a child, with a disabled child, who was just like basically showing us how they kind of like changed games and like even sought out their specific ways of playing within the game, to an extent even like creating a game for them within this game structure that was afforded to them. It was brilliant, right? And I think that happens more than just with this person. If you kind of like within community, you find out that people often are game designers already when they're disabled and want to play, because they kind of like design within the constraints of the game their own kind of like access to it. But it doesn't need to be that way. And if it's kind of like readily available that different people can have, you know, access to, I mean, not all games have stories, but like, for example, different ways of accessing the same story, or different ways of accessing similar experiences, or kind of like, you know, figuring out skills. It's just like games are important for so many things. So for leisure, but also kind of like, you know, turning your brain off sometimes, or like making shared experiences. And if you create something that, you know, allows for shared experiences and can only be shared between some, if you open that up and you know enable kind of like shared experiences on eye level, like simply within single families of like mixed abilities, that kind of like changes the interaction. And I'm more interested in these kind of qualitative changes that then happen in these kind of like stories between people. Whether it changes the world, I mean, there is war in Ukraine. I'm very aware that my work does not necessarily, you know, solve anything there, and it's very much oriented on a different way. But also, not like it doesn't all have to come from a thing, and like things can happen in parallel.
I'm sure Cayley and I support the efforts of Ukraine and what's going on over there. But that actually talks to one of the biggest challenges, my next question, which is what are the biggest challenges in our field in game accessibility for investigating these things, working in the field? You know, what are some challenges that we often face when we're trying to work in games and accessibility? So Cayley, do you mind taking away that question?
The challenges broadly?
Yeah, just the biggest challenges that you can think of. So top 2 or 3.
I think, well, first of all, it can be difficult to do that kind of research in a university context, because to minimize risk to the university and the ethics, always challenging, which is also important though. You want to reduce any like unnecessary risk, but it can be very difficult to have to go through so many revisions to justify why you need to work with a certain group, which could then, I think, dissuade researchers and just end up defaulting to, you know, the most conveniently available sample of people. Another aspect that I've noticed with some virtual reality research is the self-selection of participants who, you know, do want to be in the study. If people feel like something is already not for them, then they're not going to be very likely to sign themselves up to participate in the study. So there needs to be some effort to make people more aware that, your experience and your opinion and your voice is welcome and is needed. We need to have more diverse groups of participants, but we also need to report on their data. If you have someone who does have a disability and their data ends up being an outlier somehow, then oftentimes it might just be discarded as being kind of different from the rest. And then we lose what we had recorded about that experience, which could add up. These data points from multiple different studies, they all add up to a greater understanding of that group. We shouldn't just be throwing them out because they are deviating from the norm. I find that very problematic.
Yeah, and we see that a lot in the research side of things, where like just because we have outliners and because of how the systematic system of research and publication is, that it's sometimes more difficult to publish research that have fewer sample sizes or don't have as much representation or quantitative findings based off of a misconception of accessibility research needing a higher end to be more valid, but just isn't usually possible for us unless we go out of our way and pay them large amounts, which just usually isn't always feasible in an academic setting. Katta, what are some other biggest challenges that you've encountered while working in the field of games and accessibility?
I mean, ultimately there are two that I see basically, and one of them is kind of like the quote unquote easier one. There is like a lack of knowledge and a lack of tools for kind of like the functional side of things. But the other one, and that's harder to get, is, and I'm sorry, Joseph, but it's kind of like, also pertaining to that question, is that access is kind of seen in opposition to what makes a game a game. And that is, I find that really difficult because you don't necessarily need to balance things. There is kind of like this consideration, like that those would be opposite considerations, or that they would not go together. And I always try to encourage people in being curious about these things, because there needs to be kind of like a cultural mind shift as well. There needs to be a cultural mind shift as well in terms of understanding that this is like a matter of curiosity as well, and it can be an aspect that we also consider in game design. And kind of like also understanding that we already like facilitate access all the time. We just decided to prioritize specific types of people in like giving those people access. And that we just play around with. I mean, it's not even that hard, I feel, but like play around with kind of like getting to points where this is just one aspect of like active reflection of who does this game provide access to and who it doesn't. And I'm not even a fan of saying like every game has to be accessible to everyone, but I want people to make these choices, not because like their tools weren't made up for it, or because oh, this is how we always did it, or because they never thought about what kind of bodies will be able to play specific games or will be kind of like provided access to. But I want them to make like conscious decisions and reflect on them and own them as well. This game is made for people who see, for example. That's fine. But like say that and like make that, be clear about what is required, because what we also have a lot is, and I mean, industry probably won't mind because people still buy the game, but sometimes people just buy the game and then figure out they can't play it, but then they already bought it. So, I guess that works for the industry, but it doesn't work for me conceptually.
Agreed. And that's actually kind of my biggest one of my biggest challenges in the field is a misconception between so it touches on your point a little bit, where there's misconceptions around how to make games accessible as a whole. There's various options that are available that can talk and provide the ability to play for other people. But we also have some games where, even though they are marketed as accessible and open to various parts of the population, they don't always directly express that. And so you'll have a lot of players with disabilities or players that identify as having a disability will go and purchase the game and they'll interact with it to a point, and then they'll interact with a quick time event, or they'll interact with subtitles that aren't matching, or they'll interact with a part of the game UI where they can't see an element or hear an element. The feedback's just not there for them. And that's one of the biggest problems I think our community faces that we're championing for, is that there's not a lot of information out there on what game and accessibility options are being provided to the players. We have Can I Play That does your reviews of games, which is really helpful, but they're just a small organization. You can't do that for every single game. And it's not realistic to have those expectations of them either. But they're doing a great job of promoting games and providing what accessibility options they have, which is excellent. And then another big challenge is that I find, in a more general sense, accessibility testing in games or accessibility reviews or that sort of thing, there's a lot of misconceptions of what is required and what resources are available. So we have the game accessibility guidelines. We have a few other guidelines out there that I'm blanking on the name of that are available, but a lot of the larger population just isn't aware of these things. They don't know about the game accessibility guidelines. They don't know about the developer options that are there. So a lack of knowledge is definitely a bigger issue that we run into, or a lack of knowing the resources. And that's becoming more prevalent as more accessibility options are being implemented, as people are less and less aware, and they're trying to make things more accessible, but they don't have all the means and the tools that they have available. And they're also unaware of people like us who can consult on those things and are happy to.
I mean, if anything, then it's also like, yeah, you can ask people, but like also asking single people will not give you, like, disabled people have diverse lives and identities and like needs and or desires even, like it's just like anyone else, because y'all also got needs and access, requirements. They're just, I'm gonna hold that voice. That's not even a picture that works. Anyway, y'all have access needs too. I just need you to know that. And they're often met if you don't experience that is not happening. So yeah, you already experienced, like some of you already experienced it last week, but if I start like suddenly signing, then Austrian Sign Language speakers, which probably not here right now, would have access provided to them. Y'all didn't for a second, but I just repeated it, so it's fine. But like, we're constantly making these choices, but we're not making them consciously. But also, not everyone knows all of other people's experiences. The disabled community are many people, so it's really important not just that you understand, but also that you understand that maybe sometimes you don't understand, and so you have to ask many people, and also sometimes have conflicting realities stand next to each other, and then you make choices. But at least you've thought about them.
Agreed. One of my favorite quotes is, having conflicting thoughts or opposing thoughts is a sign of intelligence, because, and that pops up in accessibility a lot, is that, well, something might be accessible for one population, that's not necessarily true for another. We see that a lot for people who might have vision impairments in games, because unfortunately most of the mainstream games, I will say, are more of a visual medium. All right, so Cayley, did you want to talk about that at all?
I don't think I have anything specific to add for this one, but I have many thoughts and feelings.
All right, so my next question, so we're going to start accepting questions from the audience. We already have a list of questions that we got before this started. And one of the bigger ones is, how can a design student or a student in the field of design, what have you, or somebody who's looking to get into games accessibility, how can they go about it? What are some barriers they might accomplish or run into when trying to get into the field? We've talked about some of those barriers already, specifically recruitment. But Cayley, what are some barriers some students might, or design students or other students, user researcher students, come across, and how do they overcome them? Excuse me, I have to stop a dog.
I might also have some assorted dog noises happen in the near future, but how can they enter the field? It's so difficult. There've been a lot of people I've spoken to who have had completely different trajectories, and there are more programs now academically that kind of specialize in game design and game development. However, the outcomes of those programs vary widely. Dr. Whitson, who's a GI member, has a project going on right now called the First 3 Years, where they're finding people who are in these programs at different universities in the US and in Canada and interviewing them over time to figure out, like, what are you learning? What are the outcomes? And so far, it sounds like they are getting a very different experience from those. So that's unfortunate, but I mean, it's also a first step to identify that that is a problem so that then something can be done about it. It does seem like having an independently driven project that you work on kind of in your hobby time helps to develop those skills, because often you're not going to learn necessarily character design or how to work in Unity or sound design in any one specific course. They're kind of skills that are cobbled together from different places. Finally, game jams. Join game jams. I have maybe a little vested interest in game jams. I think they're great. They can be really fun and just a short way to engage in the process, no matter your skill level. It really helps if you come to the weekend with an idea of what you want to work on or what you want to improve on in this instance, so that you can feel like, well, at least, if I didn't finish my game, I figured out how to make better sprites or something. Then you can still have that personal sense of like, I did the thing. And those are super fun. And there's so many of them that are online now, which is great. The GI hosts one once every term, last weekend of the first month of term, usually. So sign up for the mailing list if you want to find out about those. I think that's all I've got for now. Katta, do you have anything to add?
Well, since this is a mostly, I feel like, North American audience, I'm not sure how helpful I can be there, not being positioned there. But just as a general thing, I mean, you mentioned IRBs, but it's not just IRBs. And sorry, this also ties a bit into Joyce's question. But of course, there is also like a difficulty, not kind of like in recruitment. Well, two, like just conceptually. In terms of the research area, I mean, I do understand that a lot of people who work like in the context of at least neurodivergence in games or disability in games kind of have to make games productive for something under a medical gaze of like fixing this. But people are making them do things or making us do things that we don't want to do. So there is kind of like a funding issue that kind of comes with that problem solving logic more than and that inherently then renders disabled people as problems, which is uncomfortable and not really appropriate. But because of that, we don't see a lot of games research. I feel like that's a contributing factor to not seeing a lot of games research. There's more from a kind of like empowered perspective, or kind of like an equity justice perspective, or a non-medical at least. So the other thing is then also that a lot of disabled people are over-researched and over-researched from that medical gaze. So that means a lot of people might not just like, trust you. And if you, and like, I mean, that's a bit unfortunate, but, and it's also not your fault, because it's just histories and histories of like being basically epistemically exploited and extracted from, and then not having any kind of like feedback into the communities. And it's not necessarily that people have so much stigma, but they it might be true for some people, but it's not necessarily that. It can also just be like, they're sick of being researched by people who they don't identify with and who they don't feel like they're getting anything back with. But you can kind of like get around that. But one is like, I mean, I initially only researched with people who shared similar or same diagnoses as I did, because I felt like, we already have reciprocity and I'm also representative. I have kind of like broadened my stance what relates to my disability experience into the deaf community, but that took like before I started doing that, I had like 1.5 years of sign language education before I even started working with people on things, and it was always like kind of led by their interests. I currently in my studies have to kind of like, you know, circumvent that a bit in my study papers, but like otherwise, I mean, like I do an actual degree, but anyway, to the point, like, you know, you kind of like also need to get too culturally into disabled people's lives and like understanding and kind of like share that and reciprocate on like multiple levels to kind of like make sure you're not amplifying into harms or like notions of neglect that people have experienced throughout history. Really, that might be a kind of like a barrier, but like also it's an opportunity. I don't want to call it that, honestly, because it has this neoliberal flair into it. But you know, disabled people, you don't know a lot about them, so it's like, you know, kind of like because of the segregation practices in our societies, and so kind of curious about what you might learn and what you might, like, you know, not in that extractive sense, but like in a solidary kind of like way, what you can give to each other, and not just seeing like as something that you can provide for, you know, poor disabled people, not poor necessarily, or like what they can do for your thesis, but rather kind of like a mutual thing, a mutual journey.
Yeah, I can't agree with that more. One of the barriers that I faced personally when I was trying to get into the games and accessibility world was just a lack of contact, a lack of contacts and context. So not really knowing what kind of barriers somebody who lives without any means of hearing whatsoever and what that looks like. I didn't understand that. So, and that's a major barrier when approaching accessibility from the ground up. Especially if you're new in the field, you might be passionate about accessibility. You might really care about the needs of marginalized individuals. My advice is to reach out to professionals like Katta, like Cayley, like myself and other accessibility experts. Look into what kind of things that are happening, how they can contextualize, or even ask them how they got involved in the space, because that involvement is often I wouldn't say unintentionally, sometimes it's intentionally, but that involvement is sometimes gate kept for people who might have ulterior motives. And even when it's not gate kept, that information is usually highly sought after by various people. So just getting involved is really important, but do so with a respectful approach. No one wants to be walked up to and be like, I understand that you have, even if you say it nicely, I understand that you identify as a disability. What's that look like? Tell me about your like life like that. Like, you can ask those questions in certain social spaces, but normally it's best to ask those questions in such a way that is unoffensive, and you can't even learn how to ask the right questions until you get involved in the community and really understand where they're coming from and get the context from that community. There's also various resources out there to overcome those things. You can look at the Games Accessibility Conference, there's the Games Accessibility Guidelines, there's some few other things. So I think the biggest barrier to overcoming a lot of the challenges that we've just discussed is to be passionate and considerate when you're pursuing games and accessibility. So if that means going out of your way to do things, go ahead, but do it in such a way that's acceptable. We are seeing a few things in chat. So Katta and Cayley, if you see some questions that you want to answer in the chat that we do have answers to, but we don't have the capacity to answer because we're already talking, feel free to answer them. I won't have the capacity to answer the questions in the chat, unfortunately, but they both might. So I do have one question that I personally don't have a lot of experience with, which is Cayley or Katta, whichever you prefer, because I see you're both typing. do you have any advice for accessibility or accessible protest planning? So any advice for somebody who might want to protest and how to make that accessible? And for those who might not be unaware or might be unaware, protesting is a completely and totally legal approach as long as you do it in a respectful way. So
I think there's something to be said about how we envision protest or what protest looks like, because the first thing that my mind goes to is like hordes of people, which for me personally, like crowds and many people speaking at once is an immediate no-go. But there is that desire, you want to still contribute somehow. So if there are just ways that people can, be made aware of how they can help, if that in-person thing is still kind of what the organizers want to do, they should know that there are probably a lot more people whose voices want to be heard, and figure out how can they still contribute so that they can kind of put themselves behind that cause. And then just thinking through, like, how could protest be different? What could it look like virtually? What could it look like through social media or through like those campaigns where people mail in stuff or knit things? Like there's so many options for that, and we just need to, I think, expand what our action looks like.
But also there are, the crit movements have like a history of like, protests really. Like the ADA is based on protests in the US now. Like also in like my environments, you have lots and lots of like different kind of like protest movements. You have disability rights movements. We constantly go on the street, and like one of the things is that we move maybe a little bit slower, or that we say things 3 times because we say them in like, spoken language, sign language, and then easy spoken language. But like, you take some time and you make sure that people come. But like, we have shit to protest about, and I feel it's like, oh, sorry for the language, but like we have things to be mad about, and we are, and like we already do that kind of protest. And what you do is like you try and anticipate needs and listen to needs that other people's also have. But like, I love, there's this one paper, I'm gonna look it up, but there's this one paper where somebody's also like, I don't want pity from others, and so my protests are kind of like, I want to be on the street and like, keep someone from their commute, because then they take me seriously, because then they understand that I'm pissed and not that I want pity. And like there's a specific kind of like flavor for disability community protests, and like I also want to acknowledge that because it's cool.
Yeah, I agree. This also touches on kind of one of your earlier papers, which talks about the movement of nothing about us without us. This would include protests. If you're protesting about the needs of people that may identify as having a disability or something like that, include those people as best you can. It's really important that you're not kind of sitting there. You may be very passionate about accessibility and the needs of people with disabilities, but their voices are usually, and their lived experiences are usually very valuable and very important. So always, my advice would be always involve them, as Cayley and Katta have suggested, involve them, make them accessible, but also approach different forms of protesting. There are written letters, there are social media movements and that sort of thing. There's always some way to involve people with disabilities. That's probably too broad of a statement. There's usually a way to involve people with disabilities in protests. Didn't want to go too general there, because another interesting question might be, what kind of education do you need to be, let me check time. Okay, we're almost out of time. So now I'll start with the actual spicy questions. All right, so Katta and Cayley, I need one of you to volunteer to go for the first spicy question.
I'm scared. I'm British. I don't have much tolerance for spice.
Okay.
Like before we even know it, but like I can do it. It's fine. I'm probably not even phased.
All right, that's what I thought. Cayley, as much as I value your opinion, I thought Katta would be more comfortable going first, just because Cayley, you're super nice all the time. You're like the nicest person. Whereas Katta and I are just like, no, we're not nice. We're gonna say it how it is. And both viewpoints are valuable, by the way. All right, Katta. What do you think about the latest boycott of the latest Harry Potter game and the events surrounding that?
I mean, that's under my notion of access. Of course, that doesn't only involve disabled people, that involves broader things. But I also find it hilarious to speak of a boycott. Didn't that game already cross 1 billion? I'm not sure what boycott people are talking about. Nothing happened, really. So that's one aspect of seeing that, like, you know, that didn't happen. What it maybe did is kind of like point out that, you know, trans people are people who are also a marginalized community, and like differently so, and I don't want to put it on the same thing, but like, you know, not afforded access to a kind of like environment there. But I mean, there are so many issues with that game. Anyway, like there's kind of like an anti-Semitic undertone, which is not due to the author of the original text necessarily, but there has definitely been a far-right game developer been overseeing most of the story development. So access can mean multiple things to multiple people, as we also try to say. We're focusing here on also accessibility and disabled people, but like in that regard, like I don't want to play it because, like, you know, I don't want to play things like that, but like that is my choice, and I'm like, you know, thinking that everybody else can make their own choices. I don't see a huge boycott movement. I see more talking about a boycott movement, and I see a game that made $1 billion in gross sales so far, so I'm not sure whether that even happened.
Yeah,
Maybe the answer was spicier than the question, I'm just realizing.
No, that's all right. As I actually kind of predicted it might be. So as for my side of things, yeah, I'm not really seeing much. I'm seeing a lot of discussion of the boycott, and I'm seeing some negative repercussions from the boycott, like people getting attacked because they're playing it and that sort of thing. And I think that it's important to approach things in a nice way, but also 100% speak your truth. If you are aware that the development and the processing and playing of this game or purchasing of this game is directly attributing to things in your life, it's 100% your prerogative and your freedom to speak about that and talk about those things. So I wanted to actually answer one last question from both of you. What is something that you hear a lot and you're sick of saying, but you'd like to say it anyway? Or what's a question you hear a lot and you're sick of saying, but you want to say it anyway?
Cayley, how do we make this thing more accessible?
Why are you here sick of that?
I don't know. There's like just this thing called Google that became really frustrating in the past, where it's almost like if you express an interest or a commitment to accessibility on a wider team that maybe doesn't have the knowledge or experience, then there's a risk of becoming that person who now has to know all the things, and people kind of offloading responsibility. And it needs to be a team effort where we're all trying to understand what needs to be done and to get the answers that are needed. It's exploitative to just expect one person to be responsible for that, and it's not fair, because I don't know, I'm a sensitive person sometimes, and so then you also start to feel like, oh, if something goes wrong, it's my fault, when it's not. It's just a systematic failure, I think, to account in the overall design process for how we're making, you know, accessible design decisions. Instead, they may get left to the end or when it's too late and things are already kind of baked in, and then there's just the accessibility person go fix it.
Yeah, I can definitely feel that. Katta, go ahead and answer. I can repeat the question if you need me to.
Yeah, maybe just do.
So the question is, what is a question that you're really tired of hearing, but you want to talk about anyway?
Oh, right. I don't like, you know, 3:15. I don't even mind questions because I think an inquisitive mind is great, and like even if I have to like answer the same thing again, like I'm actually fine with that to an extent. Sometimes I'm gonna say like, hey, I wrote that in a paper, read for yourself, but like, you know, I don't mind the question as such. And I'd rather have questions than assumptions too, to be fair. But a thing that I keep on pointing out that I feel gets kind of missed, and I do still try and figure out how to communicate it, is like sometimes people think, and like it gets kind of jumbled sometimes, where people often think like because I care about access, I know how to do technical accessibility, but my job is at a different point, and I want people to understand that like I will argue for access. I will look at people's experiences of access. I will look at, you know, how that is afforded or not, and like some of that is technical, but most of it is kind of like a cultural view on things, and like kind of like a way of understanding practices and like kind of like systems and how they act on people. And so, yeah, you can ask me about what is kind of like, you know, what your game could do or something, but I'm not going to tell you how. Because, yeah, I don't, those are two different jobs. I'm doing the other one. So that's
And
something
sometimes
that
you
I
end
kind
up
of
doing
like,
both.
yeah, no, that's fair. But like, I'm just gonna say that, like, you know, I'm not gonna be like very good at kind of like telling you exactly how to do things with, I don't know, is Unity still a thing? That's not my kind of like interest, like in research or in practice or in teaching even. Like, I don't do a lot of like the core accessibility research. I do access research, and that can take on slightly different shapes sometimes. And so that's something that I keep on saying. I'm not sure how to get the point across very well. But, you know, it's fine.
Okay, and then a question that I keep hearing is, what are some like resources that I can provide? And I'm not necessarily sick of hearing it. It's more like I'm sick of not being able to find the resources, even though I know exactly where they are, and I can't find them again to provide. So that actually leads to my last question, which is, what are some resources specific to games and accessibility that we can often used to provide and champion for it, that you're aware of? So Cayley, I'll let you go first on this one.
I think I run into similar issues where there's like a million bookmarks in different places and they get lost, and sometimes also the resources contradict one another. So there isn't any one thing that I would definitively point people towards. And I've seen discussion about toolkits in the questions we received and in the chat. And if you are working on such a thing, please keep doing that, because any way to make it easier, just to reduce the barrier for people who want to make their games more accessible, that would be so helpful. But a shortcut to that, as long as you are sensitive to, you know, how people are being involved in the process, is just making sure that you have diversity on your teams who are making the games. Because if your lived experience of playing games is different from someone else's, like, you're going to have certain assumptions about how things work that are going to come into the process. So if you don't have much of a difference in your lived experience from everyone else on your team, then you're not going to be able to kind of incorporate different ways of thinking, ways of being, ways of doing things. So until we have more, just different types of people working on games at that level, then we still run into these issues of recruiting people and trying to take shortcuts and all the rest.
Otherwise, you've been weaving them in nicely anyway. So you've mentioned the game's accessibility guideline. You've mentioned, can I play that? For board games, there's also Michael Heron's work on kind of like assessing them for accessibility. There and like these things, like reviews for accessibility or this kind of content is really useful for understanding kind of like the pain points as well. And then there's also, I mean, there's academic literature as well, but that's hard to digest sometimes. But also the Games Accessibility Conference or kind of like the special interest group of of the International Games Developers Association, if that is kind of like your field within industry. They are also just like these kind of contacts that help or that might support you in trying to find more resources. And usually all of these kind of like sites already have also their additional lists that they're going to provide, because this is woefully like, you know, small as a recommendation list. But ultimately your biggest resource is going to be around curiosity and interest in making games accessible. So I'm just like, you know, encouraging you to hone exactly that. It sounds cheesy, and it maybe is, but that's also okay.
Well, there's a lot of questions in the chat that some of them we have kind of answered in chunks, weaving in and out of other questions, but maybe if we could try to knock out a few of those like rapid fire, like one sentence per person, and see how far we get. I think we answered Joe's question earlier about how to balance need for accessibility with other design considerations. And the question about providing feedback and insights because of stigma. Was there anything else that we wanted to say on that? The full question was that it's often difficult to get disabled people to come forward to provide feedback and insights because of the stigma they face. How can we leverage games and gaming to build a safe space and perhaps shape a culture of acceptance and disability as diversity and not a hindrance?
I love that idea, like taking a sentence and answering it. Katta, did you want to say anything more about the leveraging people and getting them more involved in the research, especially about the culture of accessibility?
Yeah, one sentence. Okay, so the system is also at fault, so kind of like, you know, work with community partners and do more for them than they might do for you, because you want to. Sorry, money connectors. I cheated.
All right. Cayley, how about one sentence for, as researcher, or as a relatively new researcher to work to accessibility work, I find recruiting participants to be a particular challenge. What participant recruiting would you strategies for accessibility studies have worked well for you in the past?
Generally speaking, having community partners that you involve on an equal level, as opposed to like you are the researcher, you are recruiting from this community, that makes it much more of a one-way relationship. Whereas if there's some exchange that goes on, or mutual benefit, partnership, perhaps authorship on ensuing publications, then that can be a little less draining on people. And another note I'll add, this is more than one sentence, I'm just going to keep talking, is also thinking about your impact as a researcher. So, you know, thinking about when you do research, how do you leave that group or that community? I've had experiences before where groups have previously been open and willing to participate in research, but because of other researchers coming in and just taking and taking and taking, they just aren't willing to do it anymore. And that's really unfortunate. So do be considerate as well of the people who might come after you.
Okay, and then I'll take the question for what do you think about the relationship of modding and communities and accessibility. So that also touches on another question that's later on, so I'll kind of do both at once. So there was a question about difficulty and how to approach difficulty and accessibility. Often the game and accessibility community, if they really want to play a game and it's a very popular game, they will make it accessible to them by involving mods. And that's, we've seen that in a few Dark Souls games. I said Darksiders, I don't know why. That game's fine-ish. But Dark Souls games are a really good example of that, where it has been modded to either enable players to make it less difficult or even more challenging in some ways. And my opinion is that if the developers make the game, make it available, and the developers are on board with modding communities, then I encourage it. If the developers are strictly against it, it is part of the terms and agreement of operating the game that you don't mod it. So unfortunately, that means that you should follow those terms and agreements so that you can still play the game if it's online, or not play the game in other aspects. In that way, modding and accessibility can work together, but that's not always the case. A better approach is actually making the game accessible by working with the devs. And unfortunately, modding doesn't always listen to the devs. The modding community will sometimes say, I want to have naked people in my game. And the developers will be like, I don't want to have naked people in my game. And the modders will do it anyway. In my opinion on that is, I understand where you're coming from, but please don't. So, because, yeah, I tried to make that a short sentence.
So there was Mark with like a long comment. I don't see a question mark, but
It's at the end.
but I'm just gonna read it because like Mark should have the space. My name is Mark Kritik, and I am a game design student at Brock University. I'm a part of a startup entrepreneurship program called the Brock Link Navigate. Sorry. I'm conducting customer research and hoping to develop company in accessibility toolkits for gaming companies to ease the process of adding accessibility options to games. I am disabled myself, and I know what the disabled community is facing on a day-to-day basis, and thought that it would be a good way to help the community. I wanted to know if you have any suggestions, and if you know of anyone who is working on making games accessible to a wide variety of people with disabilities. Usually people are kind of like on a single issue kind of aspect, and that's also a problem, but it's also kind of like easier to kind of like investigate, but we do need more kind of like multiple disability studies. I've been looking at representation and disability. That was maybe one where we were across different disabilities, but yeah. I always love the work of Katrin Gelling, who just like looks at, you know, wheelchair accessible games and kind of like ways of kind of like just having fun and enjoying them, and has like this very keen look on what access to games might need or might do. But also I'm biased because I've been a postdoc with her. So.
And there's a link to Katrin Gelling's, I always botch her name, recent studies. She's definitely a pioneer in the field. There was another question that I just saw that I was going to totally shoot towards Cayley. I lost it by trying to find Catherine.
Is it the developing accessibility reporting standards?
Yes, thank you.
I like this question. So the question is from Kendall, and they asked, do you think that developing accessibility reporting standards would help not only making developers inherently want to make games more accessible, as well as giving players a fair opportunity to learn if a game is playable? Yeah, that's an interesting concept, but I can see it going multiple ways. One being, if people feel like it's too much work to meet these standards, then ignoring it completely, or you know, if it ends up applying a grade, like this game gets an A, this game gets a B, it's very complicated to figure out what does that actually mean for people who want to play the game, because a game for someone, you know, with a visual impairment versus someone with a hearing impairment, those have different needs from a game. So I'm not sure that there's one grade that we could give something to say like, you did a great job. But if there were more standardized ways for people to access that information in order to make decisions for themselves about whether they're going to play the game and they want to play the game, then that would be a huge thing, because even being able to process that information when you're trying to figure out whether something is usable for yourself is complicated. So I support this concept.
Yeah, I agree. And to touch on that just a bit, is the next question that I kind of answered from Evgeny. I'm sorry, I'm terrible with names. I literally asked Katta how to pronounce her name before we started this. And they anyway, the next question I'm actually going to give to Katta, which is about the difficulty because it looks like the question that I'm finding after that is directly at me.
So that's the one about difficulty in games and like adjusting that. Yeah, I mean, difficulty sliders are one thing, but I also last week we talked about how to kind of like mitigate or like give people a similar experience without them like, you know, having to feel like, you know, they just are failing all the time. We talked about Hades that has like, you know, that sliding god mode that you have to play free. And I think that's just such a clever way of like making sure that people who want to enjoy this for like, you know, a challenge but don't want to necessarily have like a like have a frustrating challenge that which would it would definitely be frustrating to me if I didn't have that. I'm on 80% all the time, which is the maximum, by the way, for those who are uninitiated. But you know, just seeing that progress of like that, you know, being kind of like a way of me being able to have an easier time playing this game actually made it more fun for me personally. Like, this is very personal. So I think there are clever ways of having accessibility options, and difficult sliders are probably a way to do this. But I think if you're curious, there are more. There you go.
Okay, and then the last question that I'm seeing in the chat is, which we're at time, so I'm going to answer this question as soon as possible, or as quickly as possible. I say that and then I realize that if I talk too fast, I'm in accessible speech. Great. Do you find that you are able to drive sustainable change in mindsets? So Ali, yes, 100%. Just making people aware of accessibility and the needs of accessibility usually drives change in mindset. And more importantly, I know that we have excellent people in the field of games and accessibility like Cayley and Katta, where we are driving change. We're providing insights that are readily available and well documented and also cited. So something that's kind of important in the research field is making sure you get a lot of citations, because then you get more popular and you get more grants, and it's an interesting system. Outside of that, we're also mostly working with developers and things directly, which allows us to create sustainable change in more and more examples. So a really good example of that is The Last of Us Part 1 and 2. It's got a lot of accessibility options, and it was also one of the most bought. It was Game of the Year for when it came out, and that alone, just that, knowing that's there and that driving a lot of passionate, excited, promotional, and just promoting accessibility as a whole is just one example of all the things that we as accessibility experts can promote and drive growth and change things in a sustainable way, because those get driven to the front of their mind when you're talking to game developers or researchers. Well, how do I make more money? Well, you can make your game more accessible, and then more people will buy your game. Look, there's The Last of Us. And unfortunately, money does drive a lot of mindsets. Well, I guess not unfortunately. It's unfortunate to me. That's my personal opinion. All right. Cayley or Katta, did you want to touch on that question at all?
Small comment is I think we're doing something right, because in my intro to UX course, there were so many bright-eyed, bushy-tailed students who said off the bat that they were very interested in accessibility. And so now we're teaching it integrated with the curriculum, which is so wonderful. And it was, yeah, a surprise, but a pleasant surprise to hear that from so many students.
Agreed. That's really a great surprise to have, and it definitely drives meaningful, sustained change, because these are the people that are going to be in the workforce in the future, and they are already excited about it. All right, so that was our last question. Katta, did you want to talk about it at all?
I want to support the thing of like, you know, the way that students and the students who are coming up, that gives me so much like, you know, joy every day. To kind of like see them being very inquisitive and like demanding that things are not just accessible and that there's access afforded to things, but also just like general equity and criticalness. It's just, it's fantastic. It's like what keeps me in academia, really. So there you go.
I love that. All right, so unfortunately we do have to wrap things up. Cayley, do you know if we need to talk about scripts or run anything through before we wrap up for today?
Someone can please interrupt me if there's other housekeeping to be done. But I will thank you both, Triskal and Katta, for being here on the panel today. It's so great to get to hang out with you. Daniel's appeared.
I just had one quick little thing to say. I posted a quick link for a game jam from our friends in Montreal. They're doing a game jam on accessibility. That link might only work to people with a UWaterloo address, so feel free to reach out to me if you want a PDF of that copy. Thanks so much.
Great. Yes, and thank you, Katta and Cayley, for joining me in this. It was excellent having you, and I'm a little sad that we have to end it now because we could have talked for so many more hours. And thank you all for coming, and thank you so much for your questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but I think we got most of them. And I believe Cayley is, or Dr. McArthur and Dr. Spiel are very much open to having continued questions on the topic if you do so politely. Especially Dr. McArthur, as a representative of Waterloo, is probably easier to reach out to, but please don't flood her with requests. At least not yet. Wait till she's on vacation and then she can get back like 5 to 25 emails over the summer. I'm also available. However, I will say that my capacity is pretty low for the next few months due to organizing the Games User Experience Research, or better known as the Games UR Summit that's happening in May. So my capacity is a little bit low, but I will also try to answer any questions you have. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming and have a good rest of your week.